I welcome you to this lesson in which we'll become aware of the movements of the pawns and their limitations. Now set up a sample position in which we don't have any pieces. Those are not relevant right now because we are learning in this lesson how to move the pawns. So as we see, all the pawns are on their starting positions, and the pawn has this unique ability to move either one step or two steps when it is placed on its starting position. So we see this pawn. Now all of the pawns, white pawns and all of the black pawns are at their starting positions, are at their original positions. So all of them have the ability to choose to go either one or two squares. So I can choose to play this pawn one square. Black can choose to play this pawn two squares, and I can move it two. The most important thing to notice and remember is that once a pawn has moved even one square, then later it can only go one square. For example, if I want to move this pawn two, won't be possible. It is not allowed. It can only move one square. And similar with this pawn. If you notice this pawn, it has moved one square up from its original square on d2, and now it is only possible to move this pawn one square. While if you see, the pawns which are still at the original position can move two squares. So this is very important thing to remember about the movement of the pawns. The pawns, when they are at their original positions, can move either one or two squares. But once they have moved, they can only be moved one square at a time. I hope that makes the initial movement of the pawns simple and understandable. In the next diagram, in the next position, we'll look at how a pawn makes a capture. The pawn is a little tricky piece, not as tricky as the knight, but in some ways, yes, because it moves along a straight line, but it captures sideways. So this is very unique about the pawn. Now I have set up this simple position in this. As I have marked, the white pawn can capture only the pawns on white which are placed diagonally. Let us say how the capture happens. I can go like this, or if I want, I can go like this, and I can make a capture. I cannot capture the pawn which is right in front of me. If I try to do that, it is not possible. It is not allowed according to the rules of chess. So what did you learn? The pawns move in a straight line, but they capture slanting. And instead of these two pawns, there could have been any other piece. There could have been the rook, the bishop, the knight, or the queen, and the white pawn would still have been able to capture either of those. So I hope the concept of the pawn capture is clear. The pawn captures sideways, only one step up, one step sideways. Okay, let us go to the next thing about the pawns. I hope this example makes it clear how the pawns make an capture. Now, this is even more interesting. In this lesson, we'll have a look at the unique characteristic of the pawn, which is not shared by any other piece. A pawn can transform itself into any other piece in the chessboard once it reaches the last square, the eighth rank. So I have placed some pawns both for white and black. All the pawns have done some work, traveled some distance, and now are on the seventh rank, ready to be promoted. Let us see how that happens. The moment you push the pawn to the last line, you will get an option to promote it to any piece of your own choice. You can promote it to a queen, a rook, a bishop, or a knight. Now, usually, maybe I think it is the right time to introduce you to the concept of relative value of pieces. A queen is the most powerful piece on the chessboard because it combines the movement of the rook and the bishop. It can move along a straight line and along a diagonal in all directions. It is awarded a value of 9 points. The rook is approximately 5 points, a bishop is approximately 3 points, and a knight is also 3 points. So, usually, if you see the games, most of the promotions will be to the queen. Now, it is something magical and it is one of the most transformative moments in any game of chess because a pawn, which is only 1 point in value, suddenly becomes the biggest piece on the chessboard, which is the queen. So it has this very unique ability to promote itself to any other piece on the chessboard. And if we see, black can also do the same. I can promote the pawn to a queen. And very interesting is that if you already have a queen, you can still promote all your other pawns to queens. So it is possible to have 9 queens at the same time in the chessboard. Interesting, isn't it? Now, that doesn't happen too often, but yeah, it can happen. So, let us say if I want to make this pawn into another queen, see, it is possible. And both of the sides can keep making queens like that and like that. So, when a pawn is promoted to a queen, that process is known as queening of a pawn. But it is also possible in some unique circumstances, as we'll see in some later lessons. It is also possible and sometimes beneficial or even recommended to promote the pawn to a smaller piece. So let us say if I move the pawn here and I can take a rook also, which has only 5 points as its value, not as powerful as the queen, but yes, it is possible that this might be the more logical, more interesting option in certain situations. We'll look at those positions in our future lessons. Similarly, if you see, the pawn can also promote to a bishop. This pawn I can promote to a knight. This pawn I can promote to a bishop. So it's your choice. Any pawn reaching the last line, the eighth rank, can promote itself to anything it wants, and it doesn't matter whether that set piece is already present on the chessboard. So imagine you already have your 2 knights which you got in the beginning of the game on the board, but still, for some special reason, if one of your pawn is able to reach the eighth rank, you can still promote that pawn to another knight. So that is all possible. So I hope the concept of pawn promotion is clear. A pawn, so if you see, these all white pawns, they started from here. This is the white side. This is just a sample position, just for the understanding of the concept. All the white pawns are ready to be promoted. And when they actually reach the eighth square, they will be promoted. And as we have already learned, the pawn can be promoted to anything as required by the position or the player. We can have multiple pieces of the same type. We can have 9 queens at the same time. We can have multiple knights or anything depending on the unique requirements of the position. So I hope the concept of pawn promotion is clear, and you will be able to use these ideas in your games, promote your pawns to powerful pieces, to queens, rooks, bishops, and knights, and be able to win many games. Now, as the next chapter, we'll go to a very tricky movement of the pawn, which you might have heard about or not. It is known as the en passant capture. It is a French word which means in passing. It is a special chess rule that gives pawns the option to capture a pawn which has just passed it. I will show a few examples to make us understand, make us practice the unique rule of a en passant. Now, the en passant only can happen when the pawn which is capturing is on the fifth rank from its own side. So let me count: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The pawn is on the fifth rank. And let us place a black pawn similarly, just to understand how an en passant capture can happen from both of the sides. Now, if you see, let us say I move a pawn here. Okay. And as we learned in the last example, a pawn can capture diagonally. And it can be a simple capture. It can happen. But imagine what happens if the pawn chooses to go 2 steps. Now, the rule of en passant says that black has the option to capture the pawn by pushing it back. But for this to happen, it has to happen in the very next move. Now, for example, if you see white plays b4, it has just passed the pawn on a4. And imagine black chooses to play some move with any other piece. And the game happens something like this. Now, if you notice, if I want to make a capture, it is not possible. Very important to remember that the option of the en passant capture has to be exercised on the very next move when the pawn to be captured has just moved 2 squares from its original step. If I want to do it right away, it is certainly possible. Just imagine it's a normal capture. You have an option to do it. You have an option not to do it. If you think it is beneficial to you to make this capture, you can do it, or you can simply avoid and make some other move. But very important to remember that if you choose to not make the capture, later you won't be able to do it like now. It is not possible. Let us also try a opposite capture with the white pawn. Now, as we already saw, the pawn is on the fifth square from the white side. And if either of these pawns move 2 steps, I have an option to capture opposite. See, this is how it happens. In a real game, you have to pick up the black pawn, place it 1 square backward, and then make a normal capture with your white pawn. Let us see how it happens with this pawn. The pawn moves to d5 and I can make a opposite capture. Looks little bit fishy, little bit tricky, but yeah, it is a rule of chess and you should practice it and use it whenever possible. Okay, now we'll see at situations where it looks like opposite can be done, but it cannot be. So let us say again set up a typical position. Now imagine black chooses to move this pawn only 1 square up and I don't choose to capture it because I can do anything. These are my pieces. Let us say I choose to move this king over here. And now this pawn moves 1 square up. In this position, I cannot make an opposite capture. I cannot make an opposite capture on a pawn which has moved only 1 square. The opposite can only happen when the pawn to be captured is moving 2 squares, and it can only happen on the immediate next move. It is very important to remember. Now in this position, as we just saw, the pawn has moved 2 squares, and as white I do have an option to capture the pawn on d6. I hope this lesson introduced you to the very unique rule of opposite in the correct way, and you'll be able to use this rule of chess in your favor in your games. So just as parting, we'll just make a few pawn movements and execute a few opposite captures to develop our understanding. So here the pawn has just moved 2. I can make an en passant. Black can capture me back. That is no worry. I can again move a pawn. Black can move a pawn. And if I choose to move this pawn 2 squares, black can take me as a en passant capture. And likewise, it can keep going on. We'll just keep moving just to see a few examples. Black pawn comes to the fifth square from its side. If I move this pawn 2 squares, black has the choice to make an en passant capture. The capturing pawn is on the fifth square from its own side. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. This is where the pawn was when the capture was made, and like this. And maybe we'll do a few more. I put the pawn here, and if the black pawn moves 2, I can capture it en passant. But like we also learned, if it moves 1 only, of course I can do a normal capture, but I choose to ignore it. Let us say I play something else. And now the black pawns move to c5. Now the en passant capture is not possible because, as we have already learned and I have told multiple times, the pawn which is moving 2 from its original step is the only candidate for a en passant capture. The pawn which is moving 1 cannot be captured en passant. I hope these many examples which we did to capture en passant from both sides, from both white and black pawns, made this concept a little clearer. But what I will suggest that you actually execute this maneuver, this particular move on a chessboard in your game whenever possible. Then only you will be able to use it for your advantage whenever you have an opportunity. It is my experience that many students, even after being introduced to the concept, are not able to make this capture. It is little tricky, so I suggest you practice it. Chess is a game of practice. Repeat this maneuver a few times. If you have any doubt, come back to this lesson, see it a few times to see how the opposite is being executed. And I'm sure you'll be able to do it to your advantage. Okay, so I guess we have covered the movement of the pawns, how it captures, how it can be promoted, and how it can do a en passant capture. So pawn, while being the smallest piece on the board, most numerous piece on the board, has so many unique characteristics. It can do so many unique things. It can get promoted. It can move straight but capture sideways. It can do this very unique en passant capture. And I'm sure after this lesson, you will understand more about the possibilities of the pawn and be able to play with it properly in your games. Now, before we end this lesson, one of the most important characteristics of the pawn is that it cannot go back. Now, all the pieces of the chessboard can move in any direction multiple number of times. But the disability of the pawn is that it can only go forward. It cannot ever go back. Only in the en passant capture, you have the possibility of pushing the pawn back and making an capture. But otherwise, the very unique ability or disability of the pawn is it can only go forward, it cannot go backwards. So that is why in our games, we have to be very careful with the movements of the pawns because once they move forward, they cannot be retreated. With this, we conclude this chapter of the movement of the pawns. Let us see what is next.